Welcome to Making IT Work, Deep Creek Center's blog for IT professionals committed to using best practices to provide exceptional value for their business clients.
Hi, welcome back to the blog, and today we're going to continue our conversation about customer journeys, moving to the stepping stone talking about agreement. So the previous steps in the journey have gotten us to this moment where we can enter an agreement with our customer. We began with exploration, customers looking for potential service providers who might be able to solve a particular problem for them, and service providers looking for customers that might be interested in their services. We then went through an engagement phase where we went and built our trust, identified and put in place capabilities that would enable us to have transparent views into one another, understood customer needs, and spent a little bit of time introducing the other service provider capabilities. At the end of that, we ended up building kind of a mutual capability to be able to proceed on to putting together an offer, looking specifically at customer requirements and how we might shape that demand and design certain types of solutions to be able to meet it. So in this step, we're actually going to go and try to establish an agreement with that customer. So the agree step itself is actually pretty straightforward. It begins with kind of reinforcing things that we've talked about in previous steps. We want to ensure at the moment of agreement that we have clearly aligned expectations with the customer and their respective users. This means that we understand mutually how and exactly what we're supposed to do to facilitate outcomes for them and what their expectations are around customer experience. We also want to ensure that our services are effectively aligned with their risk and compliance requirements, that the customer is optimizing the use of their resources and minimizing their costs, and that we are as well as a service provider. The next key piece of this is then planning for what we're going to call value co-creation. So again, think about value in the context of many different stakeholders. And each stakeholder has their own perspective on what is valuable. And ultimately, we want to be able to ensure that we are setting ourselves up as part of the agreement so that value is going to accrue appropriately to all of the relevant stakeholders. Now, there are a couple different ways we might approach this. We might begin by looking at the value drivers, going back to their first conversations around exploration. This is really about connecting the dots between customer assets and how they plan to use certain services to drive outcomes, and our assets and how they ultimately come together to provision and deliver services, and how you create an established chain between and among those. Another approach we might use is what we call the service interactions method. And here we want to be able to look at all the relevant interactions in the customer's journey as they go and they carry out and use the service. And we want to be able to define value streams from the customer's point of view and value streams from the service provider's point of view, to be able to describe all the relevant interactions that take place across those value streams, and to make sure that we have agreements together about how that's supposed to work, what the customer's obligations and responsibilities are, what the service provider's responsibilities are, and where we may have certain types of mutual responsibilities. Then, as the service provider, we need to start pulling together the various aspects of the service itself. Some of those characteristics might be fundamental and inherent to the service itself, the components, the interfaces, our cost of provisioning, and some of those may be assigned at the time of developing the service offering. The pricing, how we plan to support the service, any warranties associated with the service, and so forth. We then proceed with the customer to negotiate the agreement itself. And the agreement might take a number of different forms. In the context of certain agreements that are driven by legal or regulatory compliance requirements, we may have explicit obligations that we are expected to follow in order to be able to ensure that we meet those compliance requirements. For a large majority of these might be agreement-based. And here we're establishing a service level agreement as you would traditionally understand it between the customer and the service provider that lays out the terms and conditions for how and what we're committing to deliver. In a more informal situation, we might establish what we might think of as a promise-based approach, where we set mutual expectations of one another and where various types of promises are made, oftentimes based on basic social cues. So that when I, for example, call a taxi, I don't have a formal written agreement with them, but I have certain expectations that they're going to drive me where I want to go. They have certain expectations that I'm going to be able to tell them where I want to go. We have some agreements together about what that is going to cost one another and so forth. We might also extend our agreements in a way that specifically articulates certain types of outcomes the customer is trying to achieve, and talk a little bit about how the service needs to be aligned by both the customer stakeholders and the service provider stakeholders in order to best optimize and facilitate those outcomes. Lastly, just to talk a little bit about service level agreements themselves, the EIDL 4 guidance specifically looks at each of the individual words. So in service, what is the nature of the service? What are the obligations associated with the service? What is the level of expected utility of the service? What is the level of expected warranty for the service? By levels, of course, there are different levels, and different customers may choose or require different levels of utility and functionality. They may require different levels of warranty around things like security or continuity requirements, or just raw performance based on their needs. And of course, there may be many other different terms and conditions we need to negotiate as part of this. How people request changes, how frequently we run service reviews, how we drive continual improvement on both sides, and so forth.
Thank you for joining us today. Deep Creek Center provides consulting and training for businesses around the world. For more information, visit deepcreekcenter.com.